My name is Reverend Gola Wolf Richards. Welcome to this episode of the Perspectacles Podcast for global conflict resolution. With gratitude to Dr. Christopher Hunt, my wife Rachel, the board of directors and friends of the Institute for Contemplative Education in Maine, with musical and production support from my son Ryan Richards and his wife Jessica Richards, from Dove Pax at dovepax.com, and my angelic mother. We sincerely welcome your interest in our programs from broadcastwisdom.com.
Welcome to another episode of the Perspectacles Podcast. This is Ryan W. Richards, here with my father, Gola Wolf Richards. It's great to be with you, Dad.
Great to be with you, son. Very, very good to be with you.
In our last episode, we spoke about how our collective crises are affected by how we manage our individual personalities. So this week, I thought we could talk about some fundamental psychological concepts that we use to help us work through troubles in our lives and with our work with others.
Very good. Very good.
Where would you begin if somebody were to say, I want to change myself, I want to live a better life? What psychological lessons should I start with?
That's an excellent question, son. Because immediately for me, what it implies is that there's a need to understand the orientation. In what circumstances would I decide that I am improving? And in terms of what circumstances would I decide the contrary? So you have to have a field, right, that's set out for the individual to establish some parameters, some means, whereby we will have directionality. So I start with the idea of orientation. And in terms of yin-yang philosophy, an emphasis is placed there on the idea of opposites and how these opposites work in contrast, yet also work as complements to one another. So, if I were trying to understand how I am going to improve, one of the things I would have to establish is the field. In what circumstances am I operating? And if that field is very, very broad, absolutely inclusive, that would move toward the idea of being holistic, which is right to be associated with the idea of holy. In that concept, then, the idea would be that I would be making decisions that would affect how I am a matter of consequence for everything else in the field. And in terms of whether I am doing right, improving or not, I would want to be aligned within the field in such a manner that it would accord with nature's already pre-existing order. So, a part of thinking about how to improve myself would have to take into account the concepts of order and disorder. And I put a value on coming into a status of order as being positive. So if I'm well ordered within the context of the entirety of things, I can back up and say, I would start by being very proximate and say, if I'm well ordered in terms of the person nearest to me, the environment nearest to me, then that would be a beginning point for me maturing so as to become ordered within the whole encompass of life's surrounding.
And so, in terms of day-to-day order, what are some examples that our audience could consider and with what you just laid out?
hmm Very important to remember that there's an old saying, I'm sure most people will have heard it, which says, if it's out of sight, it can also become out of mind. Out of sight and out of mind. In other words, if I am going to become well-ordered, and this is again trying to add some identity to the concept of getting better, improving myself, I have to feel about things. So if the range of my feelings is narrow, self-involved, limited, then that range is not going to be very inclusive. And I can have, in a negative sense, an experience of being selfish, limited in terms of my judgment, narrow-minded, continually self-involved, as opposed to having a reciprocal concern for the environment that I am affecting. So, feelings, to the extent that they are extended, showing an interest in the environment around me, moves toward improving myself. And that, again, within the context of trying to become more like nature, which is fortunate for us, right? The circumstances wherein we see continuous relationships, transformative, positive, creative relationships between points of opposition, day and night working together, hot and cold working together, winter and summer working together, breathing in, breathing out, working together, the circulation of blood. So those examples are very fundamental, and they are also populated throughout the universe, that constant reciprocity between contrast. So if my personality, my judgment, my ego, and think of ego as the decider, if I am able to make decisions that reflect extensive feeling for near and far circumstances, then I am much more likely to be able to model my development on nature as opposed to not.
So you mentioned this term ego. It's important to point out. So that's distinct from ideas of being egotistical or the like, right?
Yes, egotistical would mean, right, that I am self-involved, self-promoting, right, without interest in the other, without having feelings, love thy neighbor as thyself, do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. Virtues, in other words. So egotistical means non-virtuous. Everyone has an ego, meaning there's a central point of concern for how we make judgments. I do things, I have an identity with regard to what I do. But it's also important to remember that there is an unconscious factor in our personalities. So the ego is not of its own accord, right, making decisions freely. It's making decisions that are conditioned by unconscious determinants also. So If I, in terms of my relationship to those unconscious factors, have a vision, a paradigm, right? I learn to hold a concept that says that this conditioning factor will reflect basic tendencies and how the entire universe works. So I will have a tendency either to become ordered, well ordered within the context of the whole, or chaotic. If I am well ordered, I'm also prepared to look for what would be chaotic as a tendency in my personality. And then I would learn to add qualities to what that would mean. If I am chaotic, and I'm trying to be very fundamental here, it would mean withdrawing my feelings from a broader and broader circumstances, deeper and deeper circumstances, limiting how I feel. Because if I make judgments without feeling far from myself, I become, even without intending it, egotistical.
And so in our conversations, the concept of ego strength comes up quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's worth sharing with the audience. What would you mean by the idea of ego strength? And then how does one strengthen their ego?
Okay. If we stick with the idea that the ego is the chooser, we are choice evolvers, as someone has said long ago. I don't recall the particular individual, but I remember enjoying that terminology. Choice evolvers. The health of an ego is to make choices that have us to be aligned such that we are having reciprocity. We are treating the environment respectfully. Basic assumptions being we persist, we survive by means of the environment around us. If we do not care for it well, right, then we are not being healthy. So the healthy ego has to be able to choose in a way that is not limited to being self-involved. The terms that we use very often to express this, you'll hear often people say God is love, which in a simple way is saying don't be self-involved if you want to be godly. The love thy neighbor as thyself, do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. These statements suggest a healthy ego. So to choose such that you are evoking order that turns out to have values of fairness, sensitivity, identity. If I want to take care of someone as well as I want them to take care of me, then choosing so as to encourage reciprocity, choosing so as to lift friendship up as opposed to animosity.
We often talk about the phrase emotion high, logic low,
Mm-hmm.
which is, I think, one of the best summaries of the central problem in psychology.
Why, thank you.
You can summarize the whole thing with just that. So do you want to talk a little bit about that term and how it's applied?
Yes, definitely so. So, holding several thoughts in mind like juggling. 1. Habit. Hold in mind conditioning. That conditioned things are powerful. We rely on conditioned energies. Your blood circulation. You really are happy that conditioned behavior is not something you have to decide about every minute, every second. Your heartbeat. You're really glad that conditioning, the seasons, and I hope by now with those mentions, those examples, you get what I'm meaning. That the universe, right, functions, it exists by means of conditioning. So, in terms of the psychology that we have, we must remember that it is easy for us to become conditioned by the structure of being infantile, being a child, such that I can have lots of impulsivity, emotions that dominate my logicality. Therefore, I need to hold the child's hand as we're crossing the road. lots of don't do right? Because I'm trying to condition, right, the child to be safe against the inward truth that the impulsivity, that's emotionality in the child, right, is going to dominate logicality, danger. So when we grow, right, ideally, we learn to bring into balance this innate tendency that we'll never get rid of so long as we are human beings, that when our emotions are high, very high, our logic tends to be low. So we know they're drunk on the highway, emotion high, logic low, not good. He or she is pissed off, emotion high, logic low, not good. I hate you, emotion high, logic low, not good. Oh, I love you so much, emotion high, logic low, not good. Always knowing that the potential for misalignment with health, with the proper ego development, with the conduct of affairs such that it moves toward peace is always potential because of the fact that human psychology operates that way. If there's not an appropriate balance between my emotionality under the governance of fairness, an ethical orientation, a sensitivity in how I make my judgments, then there's always going to be, right, a deficiency of maturity and extreme habits of immaturity throughout society.
The troubles of our times make me want to know how can I do what's right. It comes as no surprise. What's right is hard to surmise without the help of the wise to guide me on the road. What does wisdom teach about how to grow and change the way I perceive? It's not what happens to me, but how I respond to reality that paves the way to peace and a sense of hope.
In regards to the ego, so the ideal situation is that our ability to make choices consciously is strong. Therefore, we're evolving our capacities to be inclusive, compassionate, and the like. What are ways in which the ego can get weakened or have a deficit?
Mm-hmm. Looking at the human personality, we become healthy by means of learning. That's very important to remember, by means of learning. So if anything happens to my ego, or to my developmental process, such that my capacity to learn and to learn in a way that would incline me toward reciprocity, respectful, sensitive reciprocity within the context of other human beings, the scope of nature at large, then that would be injurious, for sure, if I could not choose such that I align with how nature sustains the universe in these relationships with endless points of opposition, yet we have an eternal reciprocity between endless points of opposition. So, as we are inclined by nature, to need to learn, if I have people that treat me with kindness, I am going to begin very strongly, to have a strong ego. I will have what nature has already posited as a necessary, piece of how I will play my part effectively in the rest of life. And that is to be loved and to love back. It's conditioning in a concern to give back. There are natural stages, for human beings. So as a child, I can be, thank goodness they're so cute. Otherwise, we might call them little tyrants. I can be haplessly, oh no, I shouldn't say haplessly. Will be absolutely inclined toward being self-involved. It's the nature of a child's psychology. If I am taught well, demonstrated, coached, conditioned well, then I will effectively become a positive member, well aligned within the family and prepared to be well aligned within the community and the world. It's also true that my feelings, can be such that if I'm taught well, to be concerned, when I earlier on mentioned out of sight, out of mind, that's an extreme truth. If I learn, that something about my personality is constantly affecting the status of history, to have that learning is so critical, because otherwise I can think of myself as being weak, ineffectual, having no consequence on the status of history.
In the example that you were just giving, we were talking about how the developmental process of a child is determined by how they're brought up and the environment around them, personalities around them. And so jumping ahead into adult life, when we're encountering things about our personality that are troublesome, maybe we could say anxiety, depression, or some affliction, that's a representation or an extension of the past, or how would you look at that?
In one sense, yes, we could say it's an extension of the past, and that's okay. But it's also important to remember that the past is extended into the present. So it's an active part of the present. So if we have unresolved issues, apropos to the idea of how do we conduce human behavior so that we have peace as opposed to these constant, endless wars. If we are taught that as an individual, how I manage my personality, plays a major central role in how the world can eventually get to peace. And if that's a lesson that isn't being taught, then we need to take account of the fact that neglect for teaching how to get to peace has become a conditioned custom, habit in terms of how we behave. So it's ordinary then, said with sympathy, that the majority of people will be conditioned to behave in ways that do not reflect the profound impacts that our personalities have on whether war will ever be ended without destroying humanity at large.
One thing that we talk about quite a bit as well is the idea of neurosis, which I've heard folks have varying understanding of. How would you define that, and how is it something that you are on guard against in your personality?
Every now and then, right, I had read long ago in ancient Chinese philosophy that it's important to take time and define the terms so that the people will generally be able to speak to one another meaningfully, as opposed to using these terms and getting lost in what the meanings are. So a neurosis, right, as I use it, right, in practice, I'm 78, as you know, and in terms of many years of doing counseling work and teaching, the practical understanding that I try to give people is to think first in terms of habit formations. So a neurotic behavior can have absolute, clear, intelligible nature to it, pertinent to something that happened way in the past, and even not necessarily in your own past in terms of history, how we can be conditioned to have certain reactionary patterns that are now, in the current circumstances, right, not good, not conducive to order, peace, disturbed, do not create atmosphere for a sense of coherence. So a neurotic behavior is intelligible in terms of it having stemmed from some unmet needs, some kind of unhealthy, non-positive conditioning in the past. But now it's happening on its own without it being a meaningful intention to bring order in a current circumstance. So a neurosis then is a out of time situation. It's a historic situation that is now clouding, ill-affecting present circumstances, right? And operating without, if you don't work to get rid of it, right? Operating with a compelling force on its own.
Is that what you mean when you say unconscious?
Yes, that's one way of speaking of the unconscious. You can have several layers of discussion that would be appropriate with regard to discussing the unconscious. There are very positive things from the unconscious. Thank goodness, for instance. Most of what goes on in our bodies and mind, all the transfers that go on chemically, we aren't deciding those things. Those things happen, the trillions of those behaviors that happen all the time are happening on their own, and that would fit with the idea of being unconscious. The other is there are patterns, and we think of these as archetypal. They're so practiced, they're so regular. There are certain patterns that pertain to how health comes about. There's a pattern that's involved in how the daylight moves to evening time. Evening becomes daylight once again. Spring is moved to summer. Summer moved to fall. Autumn to winter, so forth. So these patterns, when they move in an appropriately ordered fashion, bring about health. The other is contrary. When the patterns, right, are not operating well, and that is also a part of cyclicity, that you can have disorder. So you can predict then, so to speak, right? If a child is raised in a certain way that has tremendous disorder in the environment, then a pattern will be set up whereby that child is likely to display poor conditioning later on. That would be neurotic.
One of the most interesting things for me about psychology is the way in which the autonomous complex works, in terms of how I can have something acting in my personality and my awareness of it is little to none. I don't even know that it's going on. Mm-hmm. In terms of trying to uncover those things about yourself or avoid them, what are your recommendations?
Well, you begin by teaching that such a thing exists. And so my recommendation would be, if I look at the world and all of our troubles, as great as they are, is that we need fundamental teaching about how human psychology works in universal ways. What is truly fundamental, right? And that language about it needs to become systematized, such that, much like in dealing with type O blood, if you would, I can go to the Orient and the medical people would understand type O blood just the same as they would if we were in Manhattan. So, with regard to human psychology, there are ancient ways of approaching psychology that have been neglected, that pertain to how a human personality can become profoundly matured, sets up the parameters whereby, one, we would understand what does it take to become mature, and what are the implications of maturity within the context of the universe. Not simply within our families. I'm not saying simply meaning that's not important, but it's much more important to add on that it isn't simply limited. The concept being that our personalities are instruments of universal behavior. So in terms of the teaching, human beings, if we understand that by nature we must learn in order to have peace, and you wouldn't walk around, if you were to take a walk around, if you would, school systems all around the country, to all the ways that education is used to condition behaviors, and this would include the churches too. You wouldn't find much of a great emphasis on teaching human psychology so that individuals become global and cosmic citizens, suggesting that we become ordered within the context of the universe, taking into account that it is natural to expect that there's going to be opposition in the experience of being conscious. If one would expect that there's going to be opposition, and then our chief central teaching was to prepare individuals to deal with opposition such that we have order within our close personal circumstances, and order within the world, order within the environment, then that would seem to be simple, basic, good sense. Yet neglect can become habitual. So it's important then to understand that the disorder that we're experiencing nowadays, generally around the planet, right, the entire biosphere, in great trouble, that it would be natural, right, to have expected that this would come about not through intention so much as it is by neglect, hapless, unintended, innocent neglect, and falling victim then to how the universe works in this sense, that if you aren't doing the creative, positive ordering thing deliberately, intentionally, conscious evolution, then the contrary is going to come into play. Unconscious tendencies to disorder, amounting to where we are now, profound disorder, wars, hatred, suppositions being of enemies being outside, as opposed to understanding that the nature of human psychology is that except I educate myself to become a peace-giving person, then peace is not going to be inclined.
To become commonplace, it must become common to think and act in terms of it. It must become common beast to become commonplace. It must become common to think and act in terms of it. It must become common, 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 common. For beasts to become commonplace, it must become common to think and act in terms of it. It must become common, 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 common. It must become common.
Next, I want to move to our segment of interpreting the news. And there's a couple of different themes that I've seen recently coming up again and again. One is most recently the terrible hurricanes that have been going on in Florida and the southern United States. When I see the horrific destruction, and then also understand that there are people who are denying humans' role in changing the climate such that we get these unprecedented disasters, how can I apply these psychological principles we're talking about to those types of personalities that I see that I can't agree with?
That's a very good question, son. Thank you for that. I think it as a part of a good teaching for everyone, and we start with the people who are available, all right, and that might be just a handful, so to speak, around the world. It's important to understand how vulnerable we are in general, right, to not growing effectively. How vulnerable then, right, we are to conditioning factors. So if I find someone who does not have concern for the environment at large, I need to deal with that or understand that as a potential lack of health. It could be expressed in some senses. It could be a potential lack of health in terms of ethics, morality, sensitivity, right? Generalized concern, a bias, right, that develops, right, with the person never intending to be their own enemy, if you would, or the enemy of health at all. And based on limited range of vision, limited range of concern, they can set up habits that make them appear to be against me. That challenge against health, right? That challenge has to become something we take on personally. So then most important would be, am I going to have a conditioned negative reaction to this person? And by negative, I mean, I'm going to now, in a very pejorative sense, put you down, right? Stupid, idiot. Do you follow, son?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of being sensitive and saying, there but for fortune go I. And to increase, if I understand well, as I think we must learn, the more that person is antithetical to health, the more I must become for health. And I do that in part by having sympathy for that person's circumstances. To know, yes, it is entirely possible to have well-aligned thinking be completely undercut by habit structures. Everyone who is addicted to a drug, as a comparison, everyone addicted to a drug, it would be absolutely erroneous for us to think that person is deliberately using heroin, deliberately, as opposed to addictively. And stopping to think, this is contemplative, to think carefully that every behavior that I see being done, if you're a cigarette smoker, I used to be, right? And you see that behavior being done, to think that this is my healthful decision. It's not. It's the habit that dominates. And that tendency then, if I don't have conscious, well-aligned behaviors in the way that the universe works, there's always going to be a relationship between order and disorder, order and disorder. So if I'm not moving in an ordered way, such that I'm able to transform my own negativity with my creativity, then I'm expecting too much of the other.
Another thing we see, unfortunately, so often is occurrences of school shootings. And I've noticed in the media that the school shooter, the most recent one being in Georgia, and a teenage boy, is demonized by folks in the media. Is that your reaction to a personality like that, or do you have a different way of looking at it?
Yeah, I see it, unfortunately, and I feel sorry for us in general. The children, right, and the confusion that they're experiencing, right, is screaming out to society that we are missing the point in terms of what's most important to be done. So with all of the mass shootings that are happening, with all of the wars that are happening, the energy that's involved in common trajectories, right? The values that we've set, right? For more money, more money, more money, more money, more, whatever it is, fashion, whatever it might be. We do not find an abatement of energy in those other areas. So we see our children displaying great sickness, but we keep moving on. So to stand back, for those who can do, stand back and say it's really hard for humanity at large to adjust, to change directions in a timely fashion, so that most of what we see is habit force, just like an addiction. We keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. So if I feel then, and a part of the teaching I would want people to have is that my behavior, your behavior, all of our behaviors as individuals is crucial to changing the collective pattern, then that news, the news is showing us our children destroying others, destroying themselves, right? Going mad, right? Is letting me know that I need to make the structure of consciousness, the elevation of my character as a dynamic instrument of order, of sanity. I need to work on it. I need to refine myself, my understanding. I can't refine myself if I don't have compassion. So as soon as I otherize that child, such that that could not be me, that couldn't be one of my children, I've made a mistake.
The last one that I wanted to hear your thoughts on is what's going on in the Middle East with continued war, and that seems to be escalating by the day.
Mm-hmm.
How do I apply these concepts to understanding these ongoing conflicts that carry on for years and years and years and are accounting for thousands and thousands of deaths?
Mm-hmm. And we could alternatively say going on for thousands and thousands of years, accounting for millions and billions of deaths. So, for many people, we will fall into our cultural habits. We'll fall into our traditional identities. And it'll be me versus you. You understand what I'm saying, right?
Absolutely.
This side versus that side by name, right? A's versus B's, so forth and so on. The point being here, the point I'm trying to make is that instead of saying who's going to win or who's going to lose, it's time to understand it's time for us to stop war, period. That fighting is what needs to be set to rest, right? As opposed to a victor in terms of one side versus the other, right? but we need now victory over war. You have to have a theory then of how that's done. And the theory that I promote strongly is that it will never be done except we see that it's all about how individuals do self-management. That education for individuals to become peaceful, global citizens has a transpersonal effect on collective potentials for humanity at large to become peaceful. So education of the individual to become a peaceful global citizen so as to be able to understand conflict resolution as the central piece that is more important than anything else. Our technology will become dangerous for us in all forms. Primitive, picking up a stick, can become dangerous, except I have beautiful humanity. So it's very important at this point to look at that Middle Eastern situation, to look at every situation around the planet, to look at it and say, it's time for education to become chiefly oriented to peace.
So recognizing my individual role in shaping the potentials for global conflict, how do I get started? What do I do first? How do I, get going, so to speak?
Yeah. A very important part of that getting going, very important, is to have a very good understanding of how psychology works. To get going and be enthused by understanding that in the act of starting, however minuscule it might seem, right? In the very act of starting counts in terms of how the evolution of peace will come about. Just start. If I go in that direction, if I'm trying, if I want to improve the quality of how I am trying, I need to have an effective theoretical concept. Very important too to understand, what is the place of a theory? Commonplace would be for us to think that that's not very useful. That's just a theory. Do you follow? Right?
Mm-hmm.
When in truth, a theory is very practical. If I have a theory that I use as my conditioning orientation to life, then it becomes practical if it makes me into more peaceful man, if it makes me become more self-reflective, such that I'm watching the dynamics that I'm continually putting out to affect life at large. So therefore that's why in our work, all right, in the website at broadcastwisdom.com, teaching people yin-yang philosophy and psychology for global conflict resolution. So to get better at it, one has to care. So you have to fight the tendency to normalize, right, violence, to accept it as this is just the way it is, to fight the conditioned experience of feeling ourselves to be helpless, powerless individuals. I am just an individual. What can I do? To understand, right, that there is no such thing as helplessness. There is the range of effects that we have as individuals is not a something that happened in the universe, right, in some kind of dark corner where the dynamics, principles, the spiritual nature of our personality loses its relationship to the dynamics, the creative dynamics, the spiritual nature of the universe.